Hello, and welcome to TLC's Passport to Nature program. Today we'll be exploring BC's Sod and Sea. This presentation was prepared by TLC's board member Sara Wickham, but she was unable to film the audio recording before taking her maternity leave. In her absence, I will be recording the audio based on her speaking notes. My name is Diana Stenberg, and I'm TLC's Executive Director. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Sara prepared this presentation on the traditional territories of the Sauk First Nation, who have inhabited this area for thousands of years and have an intimate knowledge of this land that comes with generations of knowledge. Today's presentation will include marine terrestrial subsidies, sea wrack ecology, local ID guide, nutritional benefits, harvesting tips, and resources. So the first thing that we'll chat about today is the concept of marine terrestrial subsidies. This happens when nutrients from the marine environment are transferred to a terrestrial environment, like a forest, and the inhabitants of the terrestrial environment benefit from those marine nutrients. And there are many ways that this process takes place. In each case, the addition of these marine nutrients to land-based food webs is a complex process, and every instance really highlights how dependent and interconnected marine and terrestrial ecosystems actually are. One famous example of this happening in the Pacific Northwest is the salmon-forest interaction, which many of you may have heard of. Basically, what is happening is that after spending 1 to 4 years out in the ocean feeding on krill and smaller fish, they will return to the streams where they were born. From the saltwater ocean, they swim up the freshwater streams to the gravel beds that they hatched from. Some runs of salmon travel up to 1,000 kilometers to return to their natal stream bed. All along the way, these fish have the potential to get eaten by birds, bears, wolves, and people. One of the most important salmon consumers is bears. Bears can eat hundreds of kilos of salmon in preparation for their winter hibernation. Usually a bear will take its fishy feast into the forest to consume, so that other bears can't bully its meal away from it. But bears typically only eat the choicest parts of the salmon. Their favorites are the roe, brains, and back muscles. After consuming those goodies, they generally leave the rest of the fish in the forest to rot. Tree and plant communities in coastal rainforests are limited by the amount of nitrogen they receive. So when salmon begin rotting at the base of the trees, it acts as a fertilizer and actually boosts the tree's growth. Researchers have actually traced the uptake of marine nitrogen by trees in the forest by following the nitrogen isotope 15, which is usually only found in marine environments. They found that rivers with dependable salmon runs had larger trees with more nitrogen in them and more productive forests. In years of peak salmon abundance, the trees incorporated 80% of their nitrogen from the ocean-going salmon source. In addition to the boost in production given to trees, salmon carcasses also increase the insect population of insects in a stream and near streams. By increasing the bug population, the dead salmon are indirectly feeding their next generation and boosting the baby fish's chances of survival, as juvenile salmonoids generally eat insects. So with larger bug populations, there's more food to support more fish. Some other examples of marine terrestrial subsidies include the yearly herring spawn events. Herring migrate from the open ocean to our coastline in the late winter. They lay millions of eggs in the near shore and intertidal shoreline. This mass quantity of roe spends up to 3 weeks on the beach fertilizing and feeds huge populations of marine mammals as well as birds, river otters, rodents, bears, and wolves. Bird guano deposits are another avenue of marine nutrients to the terrestrial environment. In this example, seabirds, gulls, eagles, ravens, crows, and many others eat fish or marine invertebrates. This enriches their guano with marine nitrogen and carbon. And these nutrients are then spread around the islands or land masses that the birds roost in. Many research projects have shown the fertilization benefits to plants from bird guano. Many coastal mammals are also dependent on intertidal foraging as their main food source. Mice, shrews, voles, mink, river otter, bears, and wolves also supplement their terrestrial diets with marine invertebrates such as crabs, urchins, sea stars, chittens, clams, mussels, and limpets. In fact, First Nations have long asserted there is a distinction between the mainland timber wolves, which eat moose, deer, and beaver, and the coastal wolves roaming the islands of BC, which eat salmon and mussels and dig for clams. Recently, genetic research proved this distinction to be valid and shown that there is no interbreeding between timber wolf and coastal wolf populations. Fecal scat studies show that the coastal wolves have a diet comprised of 90% seafoods. And the last form of nutrient transfer is via sea wrack, which is simply a term for dead seaweeds that have washed ashore. Sea wrack can be directly transferred into forested environments via king tide events or by storms. These wrack deposits have been shown to directly fertilize terrestrial plants and in some cases stabilize sand dunes and slow down erosion. However, king tides and storms are isolated events. A more consistent avenue of wrack nutrient transfer is done indirectly. When wrack washes up on the beach, it provides animals at the lowest levels of the food chain with food. But beaches are dynamic environments. With tides and waves constantly pounding the shoreline, not many species can tolerate living in that environment. The few that can thrive in this environment are smallish invertebrates that can burrow down into the sand, gravel, or cobble, or retreat to dry land when the tides or waves come up. Amphipods, aka beach hoppers or sand fleas, wrack flies, rove beetles, and shore crabs are the species that specialize in living on the beach and eating sea wrack. Their diets are dependent on the event of sea wrack washing up nearest to them on the beach. 50% of the diet is made up of sea wrack, and another large portion of the diet is made up of biofilm, which is basically beach detritus, including broken down sea wrack. Here we have an example of what wrack commonly looks like on the beach. You can see the small holes in the sand that has been displaced by the amphipods, who would have eaten their meal soon after it was deposited on the beach, and then burrow down into the sand to a more moist environment, which they prefer. This was taken only 3 hours after the tide had retreated, so you can see that the insects on the beach make quick work of consuming any meal that drifts their way. So after all these little invertebrates have picked the beach clean and free of wrack, they too get chomped up. These bugs are consumed by animals higher up on the food chain, like birds, rodents, and mesocarnivores. Even coastal black bears like to eat amphipods and shore crabs. In years or regions of low herring spawn abundance, bears will turn their focus to feed on amphipods. These lipid-rich inverts provide the bears with a boost of important protein in the early spring after they wake from hibernation. Generally, they ingest a whole pile of sea wrack while scavenging for amphipods. Bears have also been reported to consume seaweeds directly. This grizzly seen here is eating some rockweed. There are also loads of documented cases of polar bears eating seaweed. Although the bears probably don't know about the healthy vitamins and minerals that they are ingesting while they do this over the centuries, they have definitely figured out what is good for them and their system. So there are many avenues for sea wrack nutrients to be transferred from the ocean into food webs on land. And sea wrack is an important part of many land-dwelling animals' diets. However, in the grand scheme of things, it is mostly overlooked as a component of the complex coastal food webs in the Pacific Northwest. One fact that is not overlooked is that we know we have a huge biomass of seaweed growing on our coastal waters. Due to coastal upwellings recirculating nutrients through our ocean, this area has some of the most productive marine coastlines in the world. Currently, there are over 600 macroalgae species recorded in our waters. On one single beach, researchers recorded 220 species of seaweeds at low tide. On top of this, the Central Coast, which is where Sara does her research, is experiencing a resurgence of kelp forests. This proliferation of kelp forests is due to the return of sea otters to our coastlines. Sea otters were hunted to extinction in BC by the 1800s by fur traders. From 1969 to 72, 89 sea otters were relocated from Alaska to the west coast of Vancouver Island and Kiagut Sound. Since then, the BC otter population has rebounded to 5,000 otters, surpassing population numbers in California and Washington, and has spread up past Cape Scott to areas on the Central Coast near Bella Bella and almost down to Barkley Sound near Banfield in the south. These otters prey on sea urchin, one of their favorite foods, and urchins are one of kelp's biggest predators. So in the absence of otters, urchins graze down the kelp forests to bare rock, creating urchin barrens. But when otters remove urchins from the ecosystem, kelp forests are given a chance to reestablish and proliferate. This whole sequence of events is called trophic cascade. The benefit of removing large amounts of urchins from an ecosystem is that it creates diverse habitat levels for pretty much every other marine species. Here you can see the effect the otters are having in this image of the kelp bed before and after otter colonization. So we know that there's lots of seaweed out there, but how does it end up trapped on a beach? And how much of it ends up getting trapped on the beach? Well, that's the part we know a lot less about, especially in the context of the Pacific Northwest. There are several variables that have the ability to affect the rate of rack accumulation. Climatic variables such as winds, tides, and swell can all detach seaweeds from their anchorages and push them on shore. There are also physical variables such as shoreline wave exposure, slope, width, and substrate, which all have the capacity to trap and keep rack in the high intertidal zone where terrestrial invertebrates can access it. And there are seasonal effects too. Many seaweed species experience periods of dieback during the fall, and harsh winter weather has the ability to tear apart kelp and eelgrass beds. So the research that Sara is doing is actually trying to figure out how much rack is washing ashore, where it is washing ashore, what species are washing ashore, and do these patterns change throughout the year? Sara has spent the last 2 summers collecting data in an attempt to answer these questions. She's done all her research in a large area of central BC called the Great Bear Rainforest. This is a map of her study area, where she is based out of the Hakaias Institute, which is actually a converted fishing lodge on Calvert Island. Her research is part of a large study called the 100 Islands Project. There are 5 graduate students all studying different components of biodiversity on islands. From Hakai, their group takes 10 to 14 days camping trips to different island archipelagos in the area where they each conduct different surveys. So far, they have surveyed 91 islands, only 9 left to hit. But why is Sara studying stinky, rotting seaweeds? Well, for the 100 Islands project, the other researchers need to know just how important sea rack is to terrestrial environments. So if one island gets a lot of rack input, will plant, mammal, or invertebrate diversity be higher there? Stay tuned to find out. Ultimately, this will help us better understand the links and interconnectivity between terrestrial and marine ecosystems, which can lead to more informed planning and management of the Great Barrier Rainforest and other coastal areas. Also, in the short term, Sara is able to help inform the Heiltsuk and Wickham First Nations of potential seaweed harvesting sites for Paropia and giant kelp. The area in which she does her research is their traditional territories, and they have been very welcoming, helpful, and a fantastic source of information on local knowledge. Another potential application of knowledge could be to develop or inform an industry for wrack harvesting by small coastal communities. There are 3 companies that are licensed to operate near Deep Bay on Vancouver Island that collect sea wrack after winter storms to sell to the market. Most goes to Europe. The demand for seaweeds as components in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, nutraceuticals, and cuisine has exceeded the ability of wild harvesting to provide raw seaweed. Wrack harvesting, as well as mass cultivation, has been employed to fill the void. Seaweeds are found in pet foods for a cheap source of beneficial minerals, soil fertilizers. The fibers present in kelps help increase the water retention on soil, plus there's trace minerals. And brown seaweeds are being used as a carbohydrate source for the synthesis of biofuels, methanol and ethanol production. Live seaweeds are also used to feed mariculture operations such as abalone farms. Experiments are being done using kelp forests for environmental remediation. Areas with high currents or wave action can be seeded with kelp to slow erosion rates. Food-wise, researchers in Oregon, who were trying to develop a tasty and nutritious strain of red seaweeds for shellfish farms, accidentally created a strain of Paropia that tastes like bacon. They are now producing and marketing it for human consumption. In Australia, research is showing that feeding cows red seaweeds drastically lowers the cow's farts and, more importantly, their burps. And their burps are a bigger contributor to methane emissions than are their farts. So these red seaweeds could play a role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we're now going to switch gears and start talking about IDing and eating seaweeds. So before we get to IDing some seaweeds, here is a quick overview of their basic anatomy. The leaves are called blades, the trunk is called the stipe, and their roots are the holdfast. There are also a small group of marine grasses, so surf grass and eelgrass. So these are actually flowering plants that live underwater. They're not algae. Surf grass is quite common in wave-exposed areas, and eelgrass is found in shallower, more protected bays and estuaries. Both of these species are very important ecologically. In Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has a zero net loss policy for eelgrass habitats, but they're not very tasty or nutritious to us humans, so we're not going to dive too deep into them today. Botanically, seaweeds are sorted into 3 groups: brown, reds, and greens. However, these designations are based on its reproductive mode and morphology, so the group a particular seaweed belongs to doesn't necessarily reflect its visual color. First up, we'll talk about a few species that are seen commonly in our waters that are edible, but not particularly tasty. So first up, the aptly named feather boa kelp. This is found in the low intertidal and subtidal. It has numerous small blades and floats that give it a furry-like appearance, and it creates smaller and shallower kelp canopies than bull or giant kelp. It also prefers warmer water. It's slowly replacing several species of cold water-loving kelp in our area. This is an invasion that signals the warming of our waters. So the walking kelp is subtidal, and it's shallow canopy forming and only seen at really, really low tides or found washed up on the beach. It has a still woody stipe that actually has growth rings, just like trees. The stipe tends to solidify upon washing ashore and looks like tree branches. Eagles even use them to build their nests. The species can live as long as 25 years, and it's called the walking kelp because they grow on cobble in wave-exposed areas. As the plant grows larger, it can hit a critical size where the wave action can bounce the plant and the cobble it is attached to around. First Nations would pick up the plant and associated cobble and form fences in order to deflect salmon into fish traps. So this is one of Sarah's favorite seaweeds. It's a surf-loving species, and it's the sea pond kelp. It is found in high exposure surf zones and only in the high intertidal. So water velocities of 14 meters per second, which cause accelerations of 41 times the pull of gravity. It is one of the few organisms that can handle this wave activity. Therefore, it has very little competition for growing space. Next up is a red species, rainbow leaf splendid iridescent seaweed. It's very common in intertidal. This will grow with one single broad flat blade, which almost feels elastic when you pick it up and pull it. It can be purple brown to yellow brown in color and is iridescent in the water. Next up is sea sacs, or dead man's fingers. It is also a very common species found in the mid to low intertidal. It looks like little fingers and is usually filled with water and is quite effective as water pistols. This water protects the seaweed from desiccation and high energy waves. Next up is Turkish towel. It's seen abundantly in the Gulf Islands, and it has a bumpy, rough texture. Some even use it as an exfoliator. It can be red, yellow, or brownish in color. So next up is a green species, sea staghorn, or dead man's fingers, or felt fingers. It is a fuzzy or felty texture with many branches and is usually bright green in color. It's local to our waters, but accidentally got introduced to the Mediterranean during World War II because Allied bombers liberated the plant from a marine research station in France, where it was being cultivated and studied. It now persists as an aggressive and troublesome weed in the Mediterranean Sea. In Asia, codium is dried and powdered into teas. So now Sarah's going to introduce some of the more commonly eaten seaweeds that you'll find on our coastlines. However, all of the algae that she's talked about so far is actually edible. All of the seaweed is actually edible. Nothing will kill you. But there is a very small handful of species that aren't particularly tasty or good for you. So acid kelps are ever so slightly poisonous, and they will cause some stomach indigestion or diarrhea. Acid kelp is a brown seaweed that contains sulfuric acid with a pH level of 2, the same as our stomachs. Because of the sulfuric acid, it also degrades very quickly, in a matter of minutes. It will break down any other organisms it comes into contact with very fast, so keep it away from anything you collect on the beach. The other seaweeds to avoid eating are a couple of reds. Bleachweed, small strap-like blades, dark reddish brown to black. It smells of bleach when crushed, probably to protect against grazers. And sea laurel. It's dark red or purple in color, grows on more exposed shores, and it contains bromine, chlorine, in its tissues, which gives it a strong chlorine odor when crushed. These compounds may function to ward off grazers. So back to the seaweeds that are edible and are also easy to find. So why eat seaweeds? Well, overall, and as a general group, any particular seaweed will have a higher nutritional value than any of the crunchy superfood greens that are so trendy these days, like kale or spinach or broccoli. Brown seaweeds are also an excellent source of fiber. All seaweeds have high levels of omega-3 fatty acids in them, but definitely their greatest value is based on their amazing ability to concentrate micronutrients from the ocean and deliver those micronutrients to us in an edible form. These micronutrients include iron, cobalt, zinc, nickel, iodine, potassium, vitamin C, A, D, and more. Most have to be absorbed into the body from plant sources. Only vitamin D and some B, niacin, and some potassium can be synthesized within our bodies. Our bodies only need trace amounts of them for survival, and they are necessary for the healthy functioning of everything in our body's systems, from bone growth to brain functioning. So brown kelp, or giant kelp, is the largest species of all seaweeds. It's perennial. It's the major canopy-forming kelp and the major component of kelp forests. It can grow up to 35 centimeters a day and may be the world's fastest growing organism. It's long stipe with many blades and gas bladders. Although it's a perennial, blades die off each winter, leaving only holdfasts and the stipe. It can live up to 8 years, but usually only lasts 4 to 5. Giant kelp contains protein and significant amounts of carbohydrates, fiber, and iodine. It is generally harvested, dried, and crushed into a powder that can be added to foods to provide vitamins and minerals. Giant kelp is also harvested for alginate, a thickener in food products like salad dressing. Some dry its blades and use them for lasagna noodles. It is also used to make roe on kelp, or inside-out sushi, where herring lay their sticky eggs on the blades, and then both the plant and the roe are harvested together. This allows herring to lay their eggs on the kelp and then swim away, as a much more sustainable practice than the sack roe fishery. Sack roe fishers use nets to capture schools of herring and harvest the entire school. For them, the roe is the only valuable part of the fish, and it's cut from the females. The males and the rest of the females' bodies are then ground up and used in fertilizer. If the female fish are actually undisturbed, then they would be able to spawn up to 7 times the number of times. First Nations communities in several locations throughout BC have banned sack roe fishers from harvesting in their traditional territories. This generally results in a standoff every spring because the Canadian government fails to recognize these closures. Roe on kelp is a traditional and contemporary food source for coastal First Nations. Currently, First Nations hold most of the licenses that allow you to harvest kelp with roe on it. After keeping some for their own communities, much of it is sent to Japan as a specialty seafood product. Bull kelp is grown subtidally and forms large canopies. It exists in any wave exposure, from sheltered, calm waters to rough, exposed, rocky shores. It's an annual species, and its growing season is between May and September, and it can grow approximately 17 centimeters per day. It contains carbon monoxide as one of the gases in its buoyancy float. Bull kelp is high in potassium, which is an important micronutrient. All of our living cells need it to function and stay alive, yet 90% of North Americans are deficient in potassium. This makes us crave salt because our taste buds can't tell the difference between sodium and potassium. So then we end up overloading on salt instead of giving our bodies what it's actually asking for. Fucoidan reduces the intensity of inflammatory responses and promotes rapid tissue healing after a wound or surgical trauma. Bull kelp is often dried, powdered, and added to foods or teas. However, it is very tasty when pickled, and the blades are very nice to eat fresh in salads, soups, or stews. Wind kelp has long brown blades with a light brown to yellow midrib running the length of the blade. There's one blade per stipe, but it can have several small blades clustered at the base of the seaweed, which are actually its reproductive sporophylls. It's found in the low intertidal at any wave exposure, and it has a high amount of omega-3s and calcium. Its calcium is found in an organic chelated form, which makes it easier for the body to absorb. It also has good content of zinc and selenium, and it's one of the seaweeds that is traditionally used in miso soup recipes. Spud kelp, or sugar rack, grows 1 meter long with stipes with several dark brown blades, and it grows in the low intertidal. It's high in sugars and contains mannitol, which is blood sugar balancing. It's a choice seaweed for fermenting due to the high sugar content, and so it's a good choice for seaweed kimchi. Rockweed, or bladderwrack, is probably the most common and abundant seaweed out there. It's generally brown with yellow golden tips ending in bumpy, warty bladders. There's only one species, and it is found all over the northern hemisphere. However, depending on what habitat it is found in, it can look slightly different. Fucus can tolerate low salinity and freezing temperatures, as well as heat and desiccation from sun exposure, which makes it one of the few species that grows hardily in the high intertidal. It forms a dense canopy in the intertidal that protects marine inverts from desiccation during low tide. It's high in fucoidin and iodine is said to stimulate the thyroid and aid in weight loss. It can be dried out, and the bladders can be eaten as a crunchy snack, or it can be dried into a powder. Nori, or black gold, grows in the high intertidal. It's reddish to black-brown to yellow in color. It's a source of protein with 50% of its dried weight. It has high amounts of vitamin A. One sheet is the equivalent of 3 eggs. It has high amounts of vitamin C from fresh nori, but it does degrade over time, and it has high caloric content. It's also a very important food source for coastal First Nations. It's harvested every May on the central and north coast. Black gold is fermented for a few days to increase the flavor, and then it's sun-dried. Then it is sprinkled on fish, rice, and everything in between. Sometimes it is also fried into seaweed chips. Its moderate and continual harvesting has proven to increase productivity of this species. Sara's study area had a poor crop last year, possibly due to the blob of warm water that had been hanging out in the current from the past couple of years. This genus provides the most seaweed food for people worldwide. It's a sister species to the black gold we have in BC, and it's what sushi paper or nori is made out of. It's a large commercial cultivating industry for this species in Asia. At one of Sara's last talks, she was also informed that it is also a Welsh breakfast staple. Some serve it mixed with oats and fried into cakes, while other variations boil it with lemon and spread it on toast. Dulse can be found in the intertidal and shallow subtidal. It also grows epiphytically on kelps and is reddish-brown and very leathery. It contains all the trace elements needed by humans. It contains iodine, which is the one that helps regulate one's metabolism through the thyroid gland, and it can play a role in weight loss or gain and in energy levels. Sea lettuce is very common in the southern Gulf Islands because it prefers protected environments and grows very well where nutrients are abnormally high, like sewage outfalls and agricultural runoff areas. It can appear white after its reproductive season and might look bleached out. It's used in skincare manufacturing companies, and they report that it tones skin, promotes formation of collagen and elastin. It's high in protein and iron, more so than an egg yolk or spinach. Calcium, manganese, potassium, silica, vitamins A, B, and C. And it can be used as a topical band-aid, antibacterial, if dried and then remoistened and put over cuts and scrapes. The nutritional benefits of seaweeds are best realized when ingested raw. However, full disclaimer, Sara does not like the taste of seaweeds, especially raw seaweeds. So for those who are more adventurous, there are some that are more palatable than others when eaten rawish. There are giant and bulk kelp blades, wakame, laver, and dulse. After collecting, make sure to rinse off epithets, sand or invertebrates living on the seaweed, and you can use some fresh or seawater for this. It's recommended to store them in the fridge or consume them quickly. Kelps will secrete a slimy mucus if stored for too long. You can add them to soups, salads, chowders, omelets, or anything else. Or use the chopped up stipe of a bull kelp into rounds and pickle it the same as you would pickle beans or cucumbers. So most people eat seaweeds in a dry flaked or powdered form. Pretty much all of the species we've discussed today are great to dry. As before, you should clean them of any critters and then rinse them in fresh water. You can sun dry them on a line in the summer, and it generally takes about a day. If it's gray or rainy, you can oven dry them. The easiest way to do this is to preheat the oven to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, spread the kelp on baking sheets, and then turn the oven off and leave the kelp drying in the warm oven for an hour or two overnight. You can also pop the seaweed in a dehydrator if you have one. Place the setting on low so that the seaweeds retain their nutrient content. Once it's dried, crush it into flakes. Use a coffee grinder to powder it, or break kelp blades into chip-sized snacks. You can then store all the dried seaweeds in a good airtight container. Any contact to air will allow the seaweed to reabsorb moisture and shorten its shelf life. So, eating dried seaweed. You can add flakes or chips to anything. Pasta sauce, hummus, bread batter, soups, stews, brownies, sprinkle it on roasted vegetables. The list goes on and on. You can add seaweed to bean-heavy dishes like chilies, and it'll have the same effect on humans as it does on cows. It'll reduce the flatulence. This is because the seaweeds neutralize the hard-to-digest starches found in beans. Also, the seaweed can leach out its mineral content. Add a blade of raw kelp and fish it out before serving, or sprinkle some flakes and stir them in for extra flavor. Kelp chips are not fishy tasting at all. They have a salty and delicious flavor, which is actually potassium. So the other thing that Sara often gets asked about is, what's the deal with putting dead seaweed in your garden? There's several ways to incorporate seaweeds into the garden. You can turn it into soil or turn it into compost as a way of adding vitamins and minerals to your garden. Seaweed is a broad spectrum fertilizer that is rich in beneficial trace minerals and hormones that stimulate plant growth. Seaweeds, especially brown seaweeds, are high in carbohydrates, which are essential building blocks in growing plants, and low cellulose, so it breaks down readily. Kelps have high fiber content, which also helps soil to retain moisture. As a mulch, it keeps garden soil from drying out of the surface, and by preventing moisture from evaporating, mulch reduces the need for watering. Mulch also covers the soil and blocks new weeds from sprouting. Slugs are immediately repelled by two things: salt and sharp-edged materials. Seaweed's natural salt content repels slugs, and within a few days of application, it dries and becomes quite crispy. Slugs do not like crispy surfaces, as the sharp, salty edges cut into their soft body tissue. Seaweed shares no diseases with land plants. What a bonus. And compacted soil can benefit as seaweed can break it down. As the material becomes incorporated into the soil, aeration is improved and the soil becomes more crumbly and moist. It also does not contain weed seeds like bark mulch, and it's free. So the best way to harvest gardening seaweed is to collect washed ashore wrack from beaches. There's no need to cut fresh stuff. Some people advocate for rinsing the sea salt well off before using it, but others say it doesn't really matter. You can add seaweed to your compost or use it as a mulch. When mulching your garden with seaweeds, apply the seaweed to the bed within 2 days. Pile it up 4 to 6 inches deep, and it will shrink quickly. Clear a small space around the plant stems. Because it shrinks so much as it dries, reapply another treatment 4 to 6 weeks after the first. Another option is to soak it for a few days in water, allowing the nutrients to leach out. This is a good option for patio plants or gardens close to your house, where you might not want to deal with the stench of rotten seaweed for a few days. So if you're feeling inspired, here are Sara's tips for gathering seaweeds. First, check local tides and buy and bring a guidebook with you. Seaweeds do absorb bad heavy metals from the ocean, as well as all the good vitamins and minerals that she's been going on about. So avoid ingesting heavy metals by collecting annual species. This way they have a short window of time to build up any heavy metals. May through July is the best time. There will be more variety as all of the annual species will be growing, but any point in the year works for collecting perennials such as rockweed, giant kelp. Bring scissors or a knife and cut at the base of the blade. Leave the stipe and other blades from the plant to regenerate. Collect into onion or mesh bags. This gives a chance for critters to escape while they're still on the shoreline. Collect from areas that are outside of large cities. And collect from areas that have strong ocean current. A good flow of water current helps prevent buildup, keeping the area fresh and renewed. The Strait of Juan de Fuca is a great flow through it. So there's a few places to get seaweed products. So for your body, you could get Sea Wench online, Sea Flora. For eating, there's Silk Road tea. The Mermaid's Potion is a minty tea with seaweed. Be Love, which is kelp blade lasagna. The Drake has a tempeh bowl. Let's see, the Souk Harbor House has 26 different seaweed species incorporated into dishes. Spinnaker's has West Coast fish plate with kelp crackers. And you can order powders from Harmonic Arts Dispensary out of Courtney, BC. And Raincoast Education does 2-day workshops in Tofino. And Wolf Camp does a weekend workshop about shellfish and seaweed harvesting at Deception Pass State Park. On behalf of TLC, I'd like to thank you for listening to this Passport to Nature video. And I'd like to thank Sara Wickham for creating this wonderful presentation. If you'd like to learn more about TLC and our Passport to Nature events, please visit our website, www.conservancy.bc.ca. Thank you.